Robert Hayes adjusted his baseball cap and walked into the TechForward Electronics store like any other customer. As the owner of this struggling chain, he had come undercover to discover why sales were plummeting, but he never expected to hear his own employee blame him for the deception. "That laptop you saw advertised?" "Yeah, that promotion ended early," the young sales rep said with practiced ease. "Corporate makes us do this stuff. The boss doesn't care about customers, just profits." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Robert's jaw tightened. What he heard next would expose the shocking truth about how his own leadership had created the very problem he was trying to solve. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in the Hayes household. Robert stood in the kitchen of their suburban Chicago home, pouring coffee into his travel mug, while his 16-year-old daughter, Amber, grabbed a granola bar from the counter. The kitchen window overlooked a neighborhood where most families were just beginning their day, school buses making their rounds and commuters backing out of driveways. "Dad, you're doing that thing again," Amber said, not looking up from her phone as she gathered her backpack. Robert glanced at her, confused, until he heard his reflection in the microwave door. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders tense with the weight of problems that seemed to multiply faster than he could solve them. "What thing?" he asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. For the past 3 months, ever since the quarterly reports showed declining sales across 6 of his 12 TechForward locations, he had carried stress like a second skin. Amber finally looked up, her green eyes, so much like her mother's, holding that peculiar mixture of teenage wisdom and genuine concern that always caught him off guard. "That thing where you look like you're trying to solve world hunger before breakfast," she said, her tone gentle despite the sarcasm. "The stores are going to be fine, Dad. You always figure it out." Robert managed a smile, though it felt forced. If only it were that simple. TechForward Electronics had been his life's work, built from a single store he had opened 15 years ago with his late wife Sarah's encouragement. What had started as a dream to provide quality technology at fair prices had grown into a regional chain employing over 200 people. But success, he was learning, could be as fragile as it was rewarding. The drive to his corporate office usually took 25 minutes, but today Robert found himself taking a detour past the Westfield location, one of the stores showing the steepest decline in sales. He parked across the street, watching through the large windows as his employees prepared for another day. Jessica Martinez, the store's lead sales representative, was setting up a laptop display, her movements efficient and practiced. From the outside, everything looked normal, professional, exactly as Robert had envisioned when he designed the store layout. But the numbers told a different story. Customer complaints had been trickling in, vague mentions of feeling pressured or misled about pricing. Online reviews, once consistently positive, now carried undertones of disappointment and frustration. Most troubling of all, several long-term customers had specifically mentioned feeling manipulated during recent purchases, though none had provided enough detail for Robert to understand exactly what was happening. His phone buzzed with a text from his operations manager. "Board meeting moved to 2 p.m. They want answers about Q3 projections." Robert stared at the message, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that had become his constant companion. The board members were patient, but their patience was not infinite. They had invested in TechForward's expansion based on consistent growth, not the mysterious decline that seemed to have no clear cause. 3 hours later, Robert sat in the glass-walled conference room on the 10th floor of his downtown office building, facing 5 board members whose expressions ranged from concerned to skeptical. The quarterly reports were spread across the mahogany table like evidence in a trial, each chart and graph telling the same troubling story. "The Westfield location alone is down 37% from last quarter," said Patricia Chen, the board's longest-serving member. Her voice carried no judgment, only the factual tone of someone who had seen too many businesses struggle to sugarcoat difficult conversations. "That's not a market fluctuation, Robert. That's a systemic problem." Robert nodded, his fingers drumming silently against his leg beneath the table. "I've reviewed the staffing reports, the inventory management, even the local competition. On paper, everything should be working. Our employees are well-trained, our prices are competitive, our customer service protocols are exactly what they've always been." "Then why are customers leaving?" asked James Morrison, leaning forward with the intensity of someone accustomed to finding solutions to complex problems. "What are we missing?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Robert found himself staring out the window at the city skyline, searching for an answer he did not yet have. Below, people moved through their lives with purpose, solving problems and making decisions based on information he wished he possessed about his own business. "I think," Robert said slowly, the words forming as he spoke them, "I need to see what our customers are actually experiencing, not what our reports tell us they should be experiencing, but what's really happening in those stores." The idea that had been forming in the back of his mind suddenly crystallized into something concrete and actionable. He had built TechForward on the principle of understanding his customers' needs, but somewhere along the way, he had become insulated from the actual customer experience by layers of management and reporting systems. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking about going undercover in your own stores?" "Exactly," Robert replied, feeling a spark of energy for the first time in weeks. "If there's something happening that's not showing up in our official channels, I need to see it firsthand. I need to experience what our customers are experiencing without the filter of knowing I'm the owner." The board members exchanged glances, and Robert could see them weighing the unusual nature of his proposal against the urgent need for answers. Finally, James nodded. "It's unorthodox, but given the circumstances, it makes sense. How long do you think you'll need?" "A few days, maybe a week. I'll start with the locations showing the steepest declines and work from there." Robert felt his pulse quicken with something that might have been excitement or anxiety. He could not tell which. "I'll pose as a regular customer, see how I'm treated, what I'm told, how the sales process actually works from the other side of the counter." That evening, Robert found himself in his home office, planning his undercover investigation with the same methodical approach he brought to all business challenges. He would need a convincing backstory, appropriate clothing that would not identify him as someone with executive-level income, and a clear set of objectives for each store visit. The backstory came first. John Miller, recently divorced father looking to buy a laptop for his college-bound daughter. The narrative felt uncomfortably close to his real situation as a widowed father, but it would give him a legitimate reason to ask detailed questions about products and pricing, while displaying the careful consideration of someone making a significant purchase on a limited budget. Clothing was easier. Robert had always preferred casual dress outside of formal business settings, so jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a baseball cap would be sufficient to blend in with typical weekend customers. He would pay cash to avoid any credit card transactions that might reveal his identity, and he would visit locations where he was least likely to be recognized by staff members. As he prepared for bed, Robert found Amber in the living room, curled up on the couch with her laptop, working on what appeared to be a history essay. The sight reminded him of why he had started TechForward in the first place, to create something meaningful that would provide security for his family while serving his community's needs. "How'd the board meeting go?" Amber asked without looking up from her screen, her fingers still moving across the keyboard with the fluid confidence of her generation's relationship with technology. "Complicated," Robert replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I'm going to try something different to figure out what's going wrong with some of the stores." This time Amber did look up, her expression curious. "What kind of different?" Robert found himself explaining the undercover plan, watching as his daughter's eyebrows rose with interest and what might have been admiration. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the implications. "That's actually pretty smart, Dad," she said finally. "Most bosses probably never see what their employees actually do when they're not around. You might learn some interesting things." Her words carried more weight than she probably intended. Robert had built his business on trust, trusting his managers to maintain standards, his employees to represent the company honestly, his systems to capture and report accurate information. But trust, he was beginning to realize, was not the same as verification. The next morning, Robert Hayes, the CEO, stayed home, and John Miller, the divorced father, set out to buy a laptop for his daughter. He had chosen the Westfield location for his first undercover visit, partly because it showed the steepest sales decline, and partly because he had only visited that store twice since its opening, reducing the chances of being recognized. The parking lot was barely half full at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, which itself was concerning. Robert remembered when his stores would be busy by mid-morning, especially the locations near shopping centers like this one. As he walked toward the entrance, he tried to see the store through a customer's eyes rather than an owner's perspective. The exterior looked professional and inviting, with clean windows displaying the latest laptop models and clear signage advertising current promotions. A banner near the entrance promised back-to-school specials, with savings up to $300 on select models. So far, nothing seemed obviously wrong. The interior was exactly as Robert had designed it. Open floor plan with clearly marked sections for different product categories, plenty of space for customers to browse comfortably, and strategically positioned demonstration units that allowed hands-on testing. The lighting was bright, but not harsh, and the overall atmosphere felt professional without being intimidating. Jessica Martinez approached him within 30 seconds of his entrance, which was exactly what company training protocols specified. Jessica was 26, had been with the company for 3 years, and had consistently received positive performance reviews. She was professionally dressed, articulate, and wore the company's standard name tag and polo shirt, with obvious pride in her appearance. "Good morning. I'm Jessica. What can I help you find today?" The greeting was friendly, enthusiastic, and perfectly aligned with company standards. Robert felt a momentary relief that perhaps his concerns had been overblown. "Hi, Jessica. I'm looking for a laptop for my daughter. She's starting college next month, and I want to make sure she has something reliable that won't break the bank." Robert delivered his cover story naturally, drawing on genuine memories of researching computers for Amber's school needs. Jessica nodded understandingly. College is expensive enough without having to worry about technology failing at the worst possible moment. "What's her major going to be?" "That'll help me recommend the right specifications." "Business administration," Robert replied, sticking to his prepared story. "She'll need something for word processing, research, maybe some basic spreadsheet work. Nothing too specialized." "Perfect. I've got several options that would work great for that." Jessica led him toward a display of mid-range laptops, her demeanor remaining professional and helpful. "This model here is really popular with students. Solid performance, good battery life, and it's currently on sale." Robert examined the laptop Jessica had indicated, noting that it was indeed a good choice for the described needs, and that the advertised sale price represented genuine value. Perhaps his concerns about this location were unfounded. The sales process was proceeding exactly as he would want it to for any customer. But as Jessica continued her presentation, something subtle began to shift. The sale price Jessica quoted was $50 higher than the advertised price displayed on the shelf tag directly below the laptop. When Robert pointed this out, Jessica's response sent the first chill of realization down his spine. "Oh, that's an old promotion," Jessica said smoothly, her tone remaining friendly and helpful. "Corporate ended that sale early, but we haven't had time to update all the shelf tags yet. The current price is what I quoted you." Robert stared at the shelf tag, which clearly showed the promotion running through the end of the month, still 2 weeks away. The discrepancy was not a mistake or oversight. It was a deliberate misrepresentation. But Jessica delivered the lie with such practiced ease that Robert realized this was not the first time she had given this explanation. "Are you sure about that?" Robert asked, keeping his voice neutral while his mind raced. "The tag says the sale runs through the end of August." Jessica's smile never wavered, but Robert caught a fleeting moment of discomfort in her eyes. "Yeah, I know it's confusing. Corporate sends out these promotions and then changes them without always updating us right away. It happens more than it should, honestly." The second lie was even more troubling than the first. Robert knew with absolute certainty that no such communication had been sent from corporate, because corporate was him. Every promotion was carefully planned and communicated well in advance, with specific procedures for price changes that required management approval and immediate signage updates. "That's frustrating," Robert said, testing how far Jessica would take the deception. "Is there any way to honor the advertised price? I mean, if it's your company's mistake." "I wish I could," Jessica replied, her tone becoming slightly more earnest, as if she were genuinely sympathetic to Robert's situation. "But my manager gets pretty strict about pricing. The owner of this chain is really focused on profit margins, and he doesn't give us much flexibility to work with customers on price adjustments." Robert felt as if he had been physically struck. Here was his own employee, in his own store, blaming him personally for a policy that did not exist. The real company policy was exactly the opposite. Employees were encouraged to resolve pricing discrepancies in the customer's favor whenever possible, specifically to avoid the kind of negative experience Jessica was creating right now. "The owner sounds like a real tough guy to work for," Robert said, his voice carefully controlled despite the fury building in his chest. Jessica's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time, Robert saw genuine frustration break through the professional veneer. "You have no idea. The guy has never worked retail a day in his life, but he sits in his fancy office downtown making all these rules about how we should treat customers. He doesn't understand the pressure we're under to hit sales targets, so he creates these impossible standards and then blames us when things don't work out perfectly." Each word hit Robert like a hammer blow. Not only was Jessica systematically deceiving customers about pricing and company policies, but she was also creating a narrative where Robert himself was the villain, a disconnected, greedy owner who cared nothing for his employees or customers. The irony was devastating. Robert had spent 15 years trying to build a company culture based on integrity and customer service, only to discover that his own employees were using his name to justify the exact opposite behavior. "So you're telling me," Robert said slowly, "that your owner makes you charge customers more than the advertised price and doesn't care if customers are unhappy about it?" "Look, I probably shouldn't be saying this," Jessica replied, lowering her voice as if sharing a confidence. "But, yeah, that's basically it. The guy is obsessed with profit margins. He sends down these memos about meeting revenue targets, and if we don't hit our numbers, we hear about it. So sometimes we have to be creative with pricing to make the math work." Robert's mind reeled as he tried to process what he was hearing. Jessica was not just lying about prices. She had constructed an entire fictional narrative about company culture and leadership to justify her deception. Worse, she seemed to genuinely believe her own story, as if she had convinced herself that customer deception was not only acceptable, but necessary given the supposedly unreasonable demands of management. "Has anyone ever complained about these pricing adjustments?" Robert asked. Jessica shrugged. "A few people here and there, but most customers don't want to make a big deal about $50 or $100. And honestly, even if they did complain, what's going to happen? Corporate doesn't care as long as the revenue numbers look good." The statement revealed something even more troubling than individual deception. Jessica believed that the entire company, from top to bottom, was complicit in cheating customers. She was not a rogue employee operating outside company standards. She thought she was following company standards, just ones that were never officially acknowledged. "How long have you been doing things this way?" Robert asked, genuinely curious about how such a system could have developed without his knowledge. "Ever since I started working here 3 years ago," Jessica replied. "The woman who trained me showed me how to handle price discrepancies and customer objections. She said the owner expected us to find ways to maximize every sale, even if it meant being flexible with advertised prices." Robert's heart sank as he realized the full scope of the problem. This was not just about Jessica, or even just about this store. If Jessica had been trained to deceive customers by another employee, and if that employee had learned the same approach from someone else, then the problem was systemic. Somewhere in his company, a culture of deception had taken root and spread, possibly across multiple locations and involving dozens of employees. "What about your manager?" Robert asked. "Does she know about these pricing strategies?" Jessica's laugh was bitter. "Are you kidding? She's the one who taught me half of this stuff. Look, I know it's not ideal, but we're just trying to keep our jobs. The pressure from corporate is insane, and if we don't hit our targets, we're gone. So we do what we have to do to survive." Robert felt sick. Jessica genuinely believed that she was protecting her job by deceiving customers, and that management not only knew about her methods, but actively encouraged them. The disconnect between Robert's intentions as an owner and his employees' understanding of those intentions was so complete that they might as well have been working for entirely different companies. "Can I ask you something?" Robert said, abandoning any pretense of being a normal customer. "Do you like working here?" The question seemed to catch Jessica off guard. Her professional smile faltered, and for a moment, Robert saw exhaustion and frustration that went deeper than job stress. "Honestly, it's a paycheck. I mean, I like helping customers find the right technology, and I'm good at explaining technical stuff in ways people can understand. But the constant pressure to hit numbers, the impossible sales targets, the feeling like you're always one bad month away from being fired. It wears you down, you know?" Robert nodded, though his throat felt tight with emotion. Jessica was describing exactly the kind of workplace environment Robert had tried desperately to avoid creating. He had implemented profit-sharing programs, comprehensive benefits, and performance reviews focused on customer satisfaction rather than pure sales volume. Yet somehow, those initiatives had been translated into the impossible pressure Jessica described. "What would make this job better for you?" Robert asked. Jessica looked around the store, as if checking to make sure her manager was not within earshot. "Honestly, just some understanding that we're dealing with real people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Most customers are good people trying to make smart purchases with limited budgets. They deserve honest information and fair prices, not sales tactics designed to squeeze every possible dollar out of them." The irony was almost unbearable. Jessica clearly understood the principles of good customer service and ethical business practices. She wanted to treat customers fairly and provide genuine value. Yet she had somehow been convinced that her own company's leadership opposed those values, forcing her to choose between her job and her integrity. "What if I told you," Robert said carefully, "that the owner might not actually want employees to use these pricing strategies?" Jessica's expression shifted to skepticism. "Then why don't we ever hear that from management? Why are the sales targets set so high that we can't hit them without finding creative ways to boost revenue? Why do the performance reviews focus entirely on numbers instead of customer satisfaction?" Each question hit Robert like a physical blow because they highlighted failures in his own leadership that he had never recognized. He had set ambitious sales targets without considering whether they could be achieved through honest means. He had focused on financial metrics because they were easy to measure, without adequately tracking the customer experience that ultimately drove those metrics. Most damaging of all, he had assumed that his values and expectations would naturally filter down through the organization without actively ensuring that they were understood and implemented at every level. "Maybe," Robert said quietly. "The owner doesn't realize how his policies are being interpreted by the people who actually interact with customers." Jessica's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Trust me, guys like that don't care about interpretation. They care about results. As long as the money keeps coming in, they don't want to hear about the details of how we make it happen." Robert stood in his own store, listening to his own employee describe him as exactly the kind of business owner he had spent his career trying not to become. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, but beneath the shock and hurt, he felt a growing sense of responsibility. He had created this situation not through malicious intent, but through inattention and failed communication. And if he had created it, he could fix it. But first, he needed to understand how deep the problem went. "Jessica," Robert said, "I appreciate your honesty. I think I need to look around at a few more options before I make a decision." "No problem," Jessica replied, her professional demeanor sliding back into place. "Take your time. And hey, if you decide you want that laptop, I might be able to find a way to get you a little closer to that advertised price. Don't tell my manager I said that, though." Robert managed a weak smile and moved away from Jessica, ostensibly to examine other laptops, but actually to process what he had just learned. The casual offer to find a way to adjust the price confirmed that Jessica's deception was not systematic or policy-driven, but rather a series of individual decisions made in response to what she perceived as corporate pressure. As Robert wandered through the store, he observed other interactions between employees and customers. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The problems with Jessica were not isolated incidents. He watched a sales associate quote a customer one price for a tablet, then add an additional service fee that had not been mentioned in the initial discussion. He overheard another employee telling a customer that a competitor's warranty was invalid, which was demonstrably false. Most troubling of all, he saw the genuine confusion and disappointment on customers' faces as they realized they were not receiving the service or pricing they had expected. These were not sophisticated scam artists being outwitted by clever sales tactics. They were regular people trying to make informed purchases while being systematically misled by employees who seemed to believe they had no choice. After an hour in the store, Robert left without making a purchase, his mind churning with questions and emotions he was not yet ready to process. He sat in his car in the parking lot, staring at the TechForward sign that bore his name and represented 15 years of his professional life, wondering how everything had gone so wrong without his knowledge. His phone buzzed with a text from Amber. "How did the Undercover thing go? Learn anything interesting?" The simple question from his daughter somehow cut through the complexity of his emotions and focused his mind on what mattered most. Not the blow to his ego or the damage to his self-perception, but the responsibility he had to fix the problems he had discovered. Robert drove home that afternoon, knowing that his investigation had revealed more than just pricing irregularities or poor customer service. It had exposed fundamental flaws in his leadership and communication that had allowed a culture of deception to flourish in an organization built on principles of integrity and customer service. But he also knew that understanding the problem was the first step toward solving it. Jessica was not a bad employee. She was a good employee working in a bad system. And if Robert had unknowingly created that system, he could deliberately change it. The question was not whether he could fix what was broken, but whether he had the courage to admit how much needed to be fixed, and whether he could rebuild trust with employees who had been convinced that their own company leadership was their enemy. That evening, as Robert sat in his home office planning his next steps, Amber knocked on the door and entered with 2 cups of tea. She set one on his desk and settled into the chair across from him, studying his face with the perceptive concern that reminded him so much of her mother. "Rough day?" she asked simply. Robert looked at his daughter, this remarkable young woman who would soon start college with dreams and ambitions of her own, and felt a profound sense of responsibility that went beyond business success or failure. He had built TechForward not just to create wealth, but to create something meaningful that could serve his community while providing security for his family. If that mission had been compromised by his own failures as a leader, then fixing it was not just a business necessity, but a moral obligation. "Yeah," he said finally, "but maybe a necessary one. I learned some things today that I needed to know, even though they were hard to hear." "What kind of things?" Robert considered how to explain the day's revelations without burdening his daughter with adult business concerns, but then realized that Amber was old enough to understand the complexities of leadership and the importance of taking responsibility for unintended consequences. "I discovered that some of my employees are treating customers badly because they think I want them to," he said. "They're lying about prices and policies, and they believe they're doing it because I'm pressuring them to make more money." Amber frowned, processing this information. "But you're not pressuring them to do that, right?" "Not intentionally. But I think I created an environment where they felt like they had to choose between keeping their jobs and treating customers honestly. And that's on me, even if it wasn't what I meant to do." His daughter nodded slowly, and Robert could see her working through the implications. "So what are you going to do about it?" The question was simple, but it cut to the heart of everything Robert had been wrestling with since leaving the store. He could fire Jessica and the other employees involved, but that would not address the systemic issues that had created the problem. He could implement new policies and oversight procedures, but that would not rebuild the trust and communication that had clearly broken down somewhere in his organization. "I think," Robert said slowly, "I need to figure out how to become the kind of leader my employees think they're working for, instead of the kind of leader I thought I was." Amber smiled, and in that expression, Robert saw approval and pride that meant more to him than any business success he had ever achieved. "That sounds like the right place to start, Dad." As Robert prepared for bed that night, he found himself thinking about the conversation with Jessica and the deeper questions it had raised about leadership, communication, and responsibility. Tomorrow, he would visit other stores and continue his investigation. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had discovered and what it would mean to fix it. The man who had walked into TechForward that morning as John Miller, divorced father looking for a laptop, had been fundamentally changed by what he had learned. Robert Hayes, CEO and owner, would emerge from this experience with a clearer understanding of what true leadership required and what it would cost to rebuild trust with the people who depended on him for their livelihoods. But for tonight, he was simply a father who had learned a difficult lesson about the gap between intentions and actions, and who was determined to close that gap no matter how much work it required. The next morning brought new resolve and a deeper commitment to understanding the full scope of the problems his investigation had revealed. Robert knew that one store visit, shocking, could not tell him everything he needed to know about what was happening across his organization. He needed to see more, hear more, and understand how widespread the issues truly were before he could develop an effective solution. Over the following week, Robert visited 4 more TechForward locations, each time posing as John Miller and each time discovering variations of the same troubling patterns he had seen at the Westfield store. Employees routinely quoted prices higher than advertised rates, blamed corporate policies that did not exist, and described their owner in terms that painted him as an out-of-touch, profit-obsessed executive who cared nothing for customer satisfaction or employee welfare. The consistency of these experiences across different locations and involving different employees forced Robert to confront a harsh truth. The problem was not with individual bad actors, but with the culture and communication systems he had created, or failed to create, within his own organization. By Friday afternoon, Robert sat in his corporate office, staring at pages of notes from his undercover visits, trying to understand how such a massive disconnect between his intentions and his employees' understanding could have developed. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. His employees genuinely believed they were working for a company that prioritized profit over integrity and that would punish them for prioritizing customer satisfaction over revenue generation. The irony was devastating. Robert had built TechForward specifically to be different from the kind of company his employees thought they worked for. He had implemented profit-sharing programs to ensure employees benefited from the company's success. He had established customer satisfaction metrics as part of performance reviews. He had created an open-door policy encouraging employees to bring concerns directly to management. Yet somehow, none of those initiatives had translated into the daily experience of frontline employees who felt pressured to deceive customers in order to keep their jobs. Robert's phone rang, interrupting his brooding. The caller ID showed Jessica Martinez's name, which seemed like more than coincidence, given how much time Robert had spent thinking about their conversation. "Mr. Hayes, this is Jessica Martinez from the Westfield store. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to talk to you about something that happened earlier this week." Robert's pulse quickened. Had Jessica somehow recognized him during his undercover visit? "What can I help you with, Jessica?" "Well, sir, I had this customer come in on Wednesday looking for a laptop for his daughter. Nice guy. Seemed really concerned about getting good value for his money. Anyway, during our conversation, he asked me some questions that got me thinking about how we handle pricing and customer service." Robert's mouth went dry. "What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know about our policies, about how you expect us to treat customers, that kind of thing. And honestly, sir, talking to him made me realize that maybe I've been making some assumptions about what you want from us that might not be accurate." The conversation was surreal. Jessica was calling to discuss Robert's own undercover visit without knowing she was speaking to the same customer. Robert struggled to keep his voice neutral while his mind raced through the implications. "What kind of assumptions?" Robert asked. Jessica's voice carried a note of uncertainty that had not been present during their face-to-face conversation. "Well, I guess I've been operating under the idea that hitting sales targets was more important than customer satisfaction, and that you expected us to find ways to maximize revenue, even if it meant being less than completely transparent about pricing." Robert felt a mix of hope and heartbreak. Jessica was questioning the very assumptions that had led to the deceptive practices Robert had witnessed, but the fact that she felt the need to call the CEO directly suggested that normal communication channels were not working effectively. "Jessica, can I ask where you got those ideas about what I expected from employees?" There was a long pause before Jessica replied. "I'm not really sure, sir. It's just been the culture here for as long as I've worked at the company. Previous managers, training from other employees, the focus on sales numbers in performance reviews. I guess I assumed that if customer satisfaction was really the priority, we'd hear more about it in our day-to-day interactions with management." The admission hit Robert like a physical blow. Jessica's assumptions had not emerged from malicious intent or poor character, but from a communication vacuum that had been filled by interpretations and cultural drift rather than clear guidance from leadership. "Jessica, what would you say if I told you that customer satisfaction and honest dealing are absolutely the top priorities for this company, even if it means occasionally missing short-term sales targets?" Another pause. "Honestly, sir, I'd say that sounds great, but I'd want to make sure that's what my direct manager understands too, because the pressure I feel every day doesn't match what you just said. Robert closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of his failures as a leader. Jessica was willing to embrace honest customer service, but only if she could trust that doing so would not jeopardize her employment. And that trust had to be built through actions and consistent communication, not just policy statements from corporate headquarters. Jessica, would you be willing to meet with me next week to discuss this further? I think there might be some gaps between what I intend for the company culture and what employees are actually experiencing. Of course, sir. I'd appreciate the chance to talk about this more. And Mr. Hayes, thanks for listening. Most employees don't expect to be able to call the CEO directly about things like this. After ending the call, Robert sat in silence for several minutes, processing the conversation and its implications. Jessica's willingness to reach out directly to corporate leadership suggested that the communication problems were not insurmountable, but they would require deliberate effort and systemic change to resolve. That evening, Robert found himself once again in his home office, but this time he was not planning investigation strategies. Instead, he was designing a comprehensive plan to rebuild trust and communication within his organization, starting with honest acknowledgement of the problems he had discovered and his own role in creating them. Amber appeared in the doorway with her usual evening tea offering, settling into her now familiar chair with the easy comfort of someone who had become her father's most trusted confidant during difficult times. "You look different tonight," she observed, studying his face with her characteristic perceptiveness. "Different how?" "Less angry, more determined, I guess. Like you've moved from figuring out what's wrong to figuring out how to fix it." Robert smiled, struck once again by his daughter's ability to read his emotional state with uncanny accuracy. "That's exactly right. I had a phone call today that helped me understand that the problems I've been finding are fixable, but only if I'm willing to admit that I created them in the first place." What kind of admission? Robert considered how to explain the complexity of leadership failures and communication breakdowns in terms that would make sense to a teenager, but then realized that Amber's perspective might be exactly what he needed to understand his own situation more clearly. "I built a company based on values like honesty and customer service," he said. "But I never made sure that my employees understood what those values actually meant in their daily work, so they filled in the gaps with their own assumptions, and those assumptions were often the opposite of what I intended." Amber nodded thoughtfully. "It's like when you tell me to be responsible, but don't explain what that looks like in specific situations. I have to guess what you mean, and sometimes I guess wrong." The analogy was perfect. Robert had communicated values and expectations at a high level while failing to provide the specific guidance employees needed to translate those values into daily actions. When faced with pressure to meet sales targets, employees had made reasonable but incorrect assumptions about how to balance competing priorities. Exactly like that. And now I have to figure out how to rebuild trust with people who thought they were doing what I wanted, even when what they were doing was the opposite of what I actually wanted. "Sounds like you need to have a lot of conversations," Amber said simply. "A lot of conversations, and a lot of changes to how the company operates. I think I've been managing from too far away, assuming that good intentions would automatically translate into good results." Amber was quiet for a moment, then asked a question that cut to the heart of Robert's concerns. "Are you going to fire the people who were lying to customers?" Robert had been wrestling with exactly that question since his first undercover visit. The easy answer would be to terminate employees who had engaged in deceptive practices, but that would not address the systemic issues that had encouraged such behavior. Moreover, employees like Jessica had demonstrated both the capacity for honest service and the desire to improve their performance given proper guidance and support. "I don't think firing them would solve the real problem." Robert said finally. They were doing what they thought I wanted them to do. The real problem is that I failed to create clear systems for communicating expectations and supporting ethical behavior. So you're going to try to fix the system instead of just punishing the people who got caught in it? That's exactly right. But it's going to require admitting that I made some serious mistakes as a leader, and that's not easy for someone who thought they were doing things the right way. Amber smiled with what looked like pride. Mom always said that the hardest part of being a parent, or a boss, I guess, was admitting when you were wrong and figuring out how to do better. The mention of Sarah brought a familiar ache, but also a sense of clarity about what needed to happen next. Sarah had always believed that leadership was about service rather than authority, and that true success meant creating environments where other people could thrive. If Robert was going to honor her memory and the values they had shared when building TechForward, he needed to focus on rebuilding rather than punishing. Over the weekend, Robert developed a comprehensive plan for addressing the problems his investigation had revealed. The plan involved 3 phases: immediate acknowledgement and accountability, systematic changes to communication and management practices, and long-term cultural transformation supported by new policies and procedures. Phase 1 would begin Monday morning with individual meetings involving every employee who had been part of his undercover investigation. These conversations would require Robert to admit his failures as a leader, while also establishing clear expectations for future behavior. The goal was not to assign blame, but to create understanding about what had gone wrong and why it could not continue. Phase 2 involved redesigning management training programs, revising performance review criteria to emphasize customer satisfaction over pure sales metrics, and implementing regular communication channels between corporate leadership and frontline employees. Robert also planned to institute monthly store visits, not undercover, but as an engaged owner seeking to understand and support his employees' daily challenges. Phase 3 was the most ambitious, creating a company culture where ethical behavior was not just encouraged, but actively supported through policies, training, and leadership modeling. This would require ongoing commitment and regular assessment to ensure that the changes were sustainable and effective. Monday morning arrived with the weight of difficult conversations ahead, but also with a sense of purpose that Robert had not felt in months. His first meeting was scheduled with Jessica Martinez, the employee whose honest phone call had helped crystallize Robert's understanding of what needed to change. Jessica arrived at the corporate office looking nervous but determined, clearly unsure what to expect from a direct meeting with the CEO. Robert had prepared carefully for this conversation, knowing that it would set the tone for all the discussions that would follow. Jessica, thank you for coming in, and thank you for that phone call on Friday. It took courage to reach out directly to corporate leadership with concerns about company culture. Thank you for listening, sir. I wasn't sure if calling was the right thing to do, but that customer I spoke with last Wednesday got me thinking about some things I've been taking for granted. Robert felt a moment of surreal humor at Jessica's reference to their undercover interaction, but he pushed that aside to focus on the larger issues at stake. Jessica, I need to share something with you that's going to change how we think about what happened last week, and about how this company operates going forward. Over the next 30 minutes, Robert explained his undercover investigation, his discovery of the systemic deception occurring across multiple locations, and his realization that employees like Jessica had been placed in impossible positions by unclear expectations and poor communication from leadership. Jessica's reactions ranged from shock to embarrassment to something that might have been relief. You were John Miller, the customer I was telling you about? Yes. And Jessica, I want you to understand something important. You were not doing anything wrong by trying to meet what you thought were my expectations. The problem was that those expectations were never clearly communicated, and the pressure you felt to maximize sales came from systems I created without thinking through their consequences. So, I'm not fired? Robert smiled, understanding the fear behind the question. You're not fired, but we are going to make some significant changes to how this company operates, and I'm going to need your help to make sure those changes actually work. The conversation that followed was one of the most productive Robert had experienced in years of business leadership. Jessica proved to have thoughtful insights about customer service, specific suggestions for improving sales processes, and genuine enthusiasm for building a company culture based on integrity rather than short-term revenue maximization. By the end of the meeting, Jessica had agreed to serve as a liaison between corporate leadership and frontline employees, helping to identify communication gaps and ensure that policy changes were understood and implemented effectively at the store level. Similar conversations took place throughout the week with other employees from Robert's undercover investigation. Each discussion revealed new insights about how corporate policies were interpreted and implemented in daily practice, and each employee expressed relief at learning that honest customer service was not just acceptable, but actively desired by company leadership. The most challenging conversation was with store managers, several of whom had unknowingly perpetuated the culture of deception by pressuring employees to meet sales targets without providing clear guidance about acceptable methods. These discussions required delicate navigation between accountability and support, helping managers understand their role in creating problems while also engaging them as partners in developing solutions. 3 months later, Robert stood in the same Westfield store where his investigation had begun, but this time he was there as himself, the owner and CEO, making one of his now regular visits to connect with employees and customers. The changes implemented over the past 12 weeks had transformed not just the sales processes, but the entire atmosphere of the location. Customer satisfaction scores had improved dramatically across all locations, and paradoxically, sales revenue had increased rather than decreased, despite the elimination of deceptive pricing practices. Employees reported higher job satisfaction and lower stress levels, and customer complaints had virtually disappeared. Jessica Martinez had been promoted to assistant manager and was leading training sessions for new employees on ethical sales practices and customer service excellence. Her enthusiasm for the work and her credibility with other frontline staff made her an ideal ambassador for the cultural changes Robert had implemented. "Mr. Hayes?" Jessica said as Robert concluded his store visit. "I wanted to thank you again for how you handled everything back in August. A lot of owners would have just fired everyone and started over." Jessica, firing everyone would have been the easy solution, but it wouldn't have solved the real problem. The real problem was my failure to create the kind of leadership and communication that would have prevented these issues in the first place. Well, whatever you want to call it, the changes have made a huge difference. I actually look forward to coming to work now, and I'm proud to tell people where I work. Robert felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond business success. The investigation that had begun as a quest to understand declining sales had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of company culture and leadership practices. More importantly, it had demonstrated that admitting mistakes and taking responsibility for systemic problems was not a sign of weak leadership, but the foundation of effective leadership. That evening, Robert sat in his home office reviewing monthly reports that showed consistent improvement across all key metrics: customer satisfaction, employee retention, sales performance, and profit margins. The numbers told a story of organizational transformation that had benefited everyone involved: customers, employees, and shareholders alike. Amber knocked and entered with the tea ritual that had become their evening tradition during the months of investigation and change. She settled into her chair and studied the reports spread across his desk. "Those look like good numbers," she observed. "They are, but the best part isn't the numbers themselves, it's what the numbers represent. We've built something that actually works the way it was supposed to work from the beginning." So the undercover thing was worth it? Robert considered the question seriously. The investigation had been one of the most challenging experiences of his professional life, forcing him to confront failures and shortcomings he had not known existed. But it had also been one of the most valuable, leading to improvements that would not have been possible without that painful but necessary period of self-examination. Absolutely. I learned that being a good leader isn't about having good intentions. It's about making sure those good intentions translate into the actual experience of the people you're leading. And sometimes that requires admitting that you've been failing in ways you never realized. Amber smiled with the wisdom that continued to surprise him. Sounds like something Mom would have said. It is exactly something Mom would have said. She always believed that leadership was about service, not authority. I think I lost sight of that somewhere along the way, but I've found it again. As Robert prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the journey from that first shocking undercover visit to the thriving company culture that had emerged from months of difficult but necessary change. The experience had taught him that true leadership required constant vigilance, regular self-examination, and the humility to admit when systems and approaches were not working as intended. But perhaps most importantly, it had demonstrated that employees want to do good work and serve customers well, given the right support and clear expectations from leadership. The deception and poor service he had discovered were not symptoms of bad character, but of bad systems that had inadvertently encouraged unethical behavior. 6 months after his undercover investigation began, Robert received a letter from a customer who had visited the Westfield store. The letter praised not just the quality of service and the honest pricing, but the genuine enthusiasm and knowledge of the staff. The customer mentioned Jessica Martinez by name, describing her as one of the most helpful and trustworthy sales representatives she had ever encountered. Robert kept that letter in his desk drawer, not as a trophy of business success, but as a reminder of what could be accomplished when leadership focused on creating environments where good people could do their best work. The letter represented the true measure of the transformation TechForward had undergone: customers who felt valued and respected, employees who took pride in their work, and a business model that proved integrity and profitability were not mutually exclusive goals. The company pin that had become Robert's chosen motif, representing the values that should guide every employee interaction, now appeared prominently in every store, worn proudly by staff members who understood what it meant and why it mattered. It served as a daily reminder that the real measure of business success was not just financial performance, but the positive impact a company could have on everyone it touched: customers, employees, and the broader community it served. Robert Hayes had set out to solve a mystery about declining sales and discovered something far more valuable: the understanding that true leadership required not just vision and determination, but the courage to examine one's own failures and the commitment to build something better from that honest acknowledgement of what needed to change.